In October 1976, Vera Sokolova, a literature teacher in Leningrad, held a student essay in her trembling hands and understood that she had a choice: report it and save herself, or protect Natalia Kuznetsova, the 16-year-old girl who wrote it. Within a week of Vera's decision, Natalia's father would lose his career as an engineer. Her mother would be fired from the public library, and Natalia herself would have a KGB file that would follow her until the day the Soviet Union collapsed. The essay's title was "On the Question of Cultural Freedom and Democratic Ideals." And what happened next shows exactly how a system built on fear could turn ordinary people into the instruments of each other's destruction. Vera Sokolova had been teaching Russian literature at secondary school number 47 in the Moskovsky district of Leningrad for 17 years. She was not a political woman, not an ideologue, not someone who spent her evenings at party meetings enthusiastically discussing the latest 5-year plan. She was a teacher who loved Pushkin and Tolstoy, who believed that literature could open minds and touch hearts, and who had watched over the years as the curriculum became increasingly restricted, as certain authors disappeared from the approved reading lists, as the space for genuine discussion narrowed year by year. She lived alone. Her husband had died in 1968 from complications related to his service in the Great Patriotic War, leaving her with a modest pension supplement and a small apartment that was considered generous by Soviet standards but would have been called cramped anywhere else. She had no children of her own, which was perhaps why she invested so much of herself in her students, learning their strengths and weaknesses, their dreams and fears, the particular way each young mind worked. The school itself was typical of Soviet educational institutions in that era. Built in the 1950s, it was a rectangular concrete building with long corridors painted in institutional green, classrooms that smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and propaganda posters on every wall reminding students of their duty to the motherland, to the party, to the bright communist future that awaited them all. There were approximately 800 students enrolled, ages 7 through 17, and the teaching staff consisted of 43 educators, all of whom understood implicitly that their role was not merely to educate, but to shape proper Soviet citizens. In 1976, the Soviet Union was in what historians would later call the era of stagnation. The ideological fervor of the Stalin years had cooled. The experimental optimism of the Khrushchev thaw had frozen over, and what remained was a system that ran on inertia, paranoia, and the quiet compliance of millions of people who had learned not to ask difficult questions. Dissidents existed certainly. Brave souls like Andrei Sakharov, who spoke out against the system, but they were rare, and they paid dearly for their courage. For most Soviet citizens, survival meant conformity, and conformity meant never writing an essay praising Western democracy. But that's exactly what Natalia Kuznetsova had done. The essay had been assigned on October 4th, a Monday, during Vera's advanced literature class for 10th grade students. The assignment was straightforward, part of the standard curriculum. Students were to write a comparative analysis of Soviet and Western literature, demonstrating their understanding of socialist realism and the superiority of Soviet cultural values. It was the kind of assignment that had been given thousands of times in thousands of schools across the Soviet Union, an exercise designed to reinforce ideology while nominally teaching critical thinking. Vera had given the students until the end of the week to complete the work, and most had turned in exactly what was expected: formulaic essays that praised Soviet authors for their dedication to depicting the noble Soviet worker. criticized Western literature for its bourgeois decadence and obsession with individual psychology over collective good, and concluded with the appropriate paeans to socialist values. These essays were tedious to read, but safe to grade, and Vera had grown accustomed over the years to the careful mediocrity that Soviet education encouraged. Natalia's essay was different from the first paragraph. It began with a quote from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, a book that Natalia should not have had access to, could not have legally obtained, and certainly should not have been quoting in a school essay. The quote was in English with a Russian translation following it, and it spoke of the importance of individual freedom and the dangers of majority tyranny. From there, Natalia had constructed an argument that was sophisticated, passionate, and utterly devastating in its implications. She argued that true literature could only flourish in conditions of freedom, that the greatest works of art came from societies that allowed for dissent and individual expression, and that the restrictions placed on Soviet writers diminished rather than enhanced their work. She cited specific examples. She mentioned George Orwell's 1984, a book that was banned in the Soviet Union. She quoted passages from Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which had been briefly published during the Khrushchev thaw, but was now considered problematic. She referenced Voice of America broadcasts she had somehow managed to listen to, and she wrote about rock music, about the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, about how music was a form of expression that transcended politics, and how the Soviet prohibition on Western music was a form of cultural poverty. But more than the specific content, it was the tone that made the essay so dangerous. Natalia wrote with conviction, with genuine passion, with the kind of sincere belief that made it clear this wasn't a teenage provocation or an attempt to be edgy. She truly believed what she was writing. She truly thought that democracy was superior to Soviet-style socialism. She truly felt that Western culture had something valuable to offer. Vera read the essay 3 times on the evening of October 9th. With each reading, her hands shook a little more. She understood immediately what she was holding. Evidence of ideological deviation, of exposure to forbidden materials, of thoughts and beliefs that the Soviet state considered dangerous enough to warrant serious investigation. She also understood what her options were, and neither was good. She could report the essay. This was the official procedure, outlined clearly in the teacher's handbook that every educator received. Any evidence of anti-Soviet agitation, any indication that a student had been exposed to Western propaganda, any sign of ideological unreliability was to be reported immediately to the school director, who would then inform the appropriate party authorities and, if necessary, the KGB. This was not optional. This was duty. Failure to report such material was itself a crime. Could itself be construed as complicity? Could itself result in consequences? Or she could destroy the essay. She could call Natalia in on Monday morning, hand back the paper, tell her firmly that such thinking was dangerous and foolish, demand that the girl rewrite the assignment in acceptable terms, and then burn the original. She could protect her student. She could give Natalia a chance to grow up, to learn caution, to survive in the system that had shaped them all. But if she chose that path, if she destroyed evidence and lied by omission, she was taking an enormous risk. What if someone else knew about the essay? What if Natalia had shown it to other students, had talked about her ideas, had been careless in ways that Vera couldn't control or predict? What if the essay had somehow already been noticed, already been reported, and Vera's failure to act would be discovered not days, but weeks or months from now? Vera had seen what happened to people who were deemed politically unreliable. She had watched colleagues disappear from the faculty over the years, their names never mentioned again, their teaching positions quietly filled by others. She had heard stories about teachers who had shown too much sympathy for wayward students, who had been accused of insufficient vigilance, who had lost not just their jobs, but their apartments, their passports, their ability to live in major cities. She was 41 years old. She had no family to support her if everything fell apart. She had no connections in the party hierarchy, no powerful friends who could protect her. She had only her teaching position, her small apartment, and the modest pension she would eventually receive if she managed to retire in good standing. And so, sometime that weekend, Vera Sokolova made her choice. She would report the essay. She would protect herself. She would do her duty as a Soviet educator and trust that the system, in its wisdom, would handle the matter appropriately. She did not sleep well that weekend, but she had made her decision, and there was a certain cold relief in knowing that the terrible responsibility had been transferred to someone else's hands. On Monday, October 11th, Vera arrived at school an hour early and went directly to the office of the school director, a humorless man in his 50s named Grigory Petrovich Lysakov, who had spent more time on party work than on educational administration, and who approached his role with the same bureaucratic thoroughness he had brought to his previous position in the municipal housing department. She explained the situation calmly, factually, trying to keep emotion out of her voice. She handed over the essay. She watched as Director Lysakov's expression shifted from mild annoyance at being disturbed early to focused attention to something that might have been fear disguised as stern professionalism. "You were right to bring this to me immediately," he said. "This is a serious matter. The girl has clearly been exposed to hostile propaganda. The question is where it came from and who else might be involved." He told Vera to say nothing to Natalia, to act as though nothing had happened, to continue teaching as normal. The matter would be handled appropriately. He assured her that she had done the right thing, that she had demonstrated proper Soviet consciousness and vigilance, and that her action would be noted favorably in her file. Vera taught her classes that day in a kind of daze. When Natalia appeared in her fourth period literature class, looking tired but attentive, settling into her usual seat in the second row, Vera could barely make eye contact. They were discussing "And Quiet Flows the Don" by Sholokov, and Natalia participated actively in the conversation, offering thoughtful comments about the novel's depiction of Cossack life during the Civil War. She seemed like any other bright 16-year-old student, eager to learn, confident in her intelligence, completely unaware that her teacher had already set in motion a process that could not be stopped. Director Lysakov had not wasted time. By midday on Monday, he had contacted the district party committee and filed a formal report about the essay. By Tuesday morning, the report had been forwarded to the Regional Education Authority and to the local KGB office, responsible for monitoring ideological threats in educational institutions. And by Wednesday afternoon, 2 men in dark suits and long coats had arrived at the school and spent 90 minutes in a closed-door meeting with Director Lysakov and the school's party secretary. On Thursday, October 14th, Natalia was called out of her mathematics class and escorted to the director's office. She never returned to regular classes at secondary school number 47. What happened in that first meeting is known from Natalia's own account, recorded years later when she was finally able to speak about it, and from the partial records that emerged after the Soviet Union's collapse. The 2 men were KGB officers from the Second Chief Directorate, which handled internal political security. They were not from the legendary interrogation cells of the Lubyanka in Moscow, but they were professionals nonetheless, experienced in extracting information and identifying ideological threats. They questioned Natalia for 3 hours that first day. Their approach was not violent, but it was relentless and psychologically sophisticated. They began by being almost friendly, suggesting that this was all just a misunderstanding that could be easily cleared up if Natalia would simply answer a few questions. Where had she gotten the book she quoted? Who had given her access to Western radio broadcasts? Were her parents involved in dissident activities? Did she have any teachers or family friends who held anti-Soviet views? Natalia, who was 16 years old and had lived her entire life in a system that taught obedience to authority, tried at first to defend her essay on intellectual grounds. She explained that she had simply been trying to write a thoughtful analysis, that she had read widely because she loved literature, that her parents had nothing to do with her ideas. She insisted that she was a loyal Soviet citizen who had simply explored some interesting philosophical questions. The officers were patient. They let her talk. They took notes. And then they began to tighten the screws. They told her that possessing banned books was a criminal offense. They told her that listening to Western radio broadcasts was illegal. They explained that distributing anti-Soviet propaganda could result in serious punishment, not just for her, but for her entire family. They asked again, where did the books come from? Who else shared these views? Was she part of a group? By the end of that first session, Natalia was crying, terrified, and completely confused about what she was supposed to say. The officers told her she would need to return the next day for further questioning, and they warned her not to discuss the interrogation with anyone, especially not her parents. They told her that cooperation would be taken into account, but obstruction would have severe consequences. She went home that Thursday evening in a state of shock. Her parents, Dmitry Ivanovich and Elena Mikhailovna Kuznetsova, were alarmed when she arrived 2 hours late, but Natalia initially told them only that there had been some trouble at school, that the director wanted to speak with them. She was trying to protect them, trying to contain the disaster, still believing somehow that if she just explained everything correctly, the situation could be resolved. That night, around 9 o'clock, there was a knock on the apartment door. It was 2 different KGB officers, and they had come to search the family's home. The search of the Kuznetsov apartment took 4 hours and was conducted with methodical thoroughness. Every book on every shelf was examined. Every drawer was opened. Every closet inspected. Every piece of furniture moved. The officers were looking for more banned literature, for evidence of dissident connections, for anything that might indicate ideological deviation or criminal activity. What they found was modest, but damning enough for their purposes. In a cardboard box under Natalia's bed, they discovered a small collection of Western books and magazines. There was a dog-eared copy of George Orwell's Animal Farm in a Samizdat edition, a self-published underground version that had been typed by hand and bound with thread. There were 3 issues of Time magazine from 1974 and 1975, which had somehow made their way into the Soviet Union despite customs controls. There was a bootleg recording of Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon on a scratched vinyl record that had been copied and recopied so many times the sound quality was terrible, but still recognizable. In Dmitri's small home office, they found a shortwave radio capable of receiving foreign broadcasts. This was not illegal in itself. Many Soviet citizens owned such radios. But combined with everything else, it became part of a pattern, evidence of a family that had perhaps too much interest in what was happening beyond Soviet borders. They also found Dmitri's engineering notebooks from his work at the Kirov plant, which manufactured heavy machinery and had military contracts. The officers confiscated these notebooks not because they contained anything classified, but because anyone under investigation for ideological reasons became potentially suspect in terms of security clearances and access to sensitive information. Dmitri and Elena watched the search in growing horror. Dmitri, who was 43 and had worked at the Kirov plant for 19 years, who had never been particularly political, who had simply wanted to raise his daughter in relative comfort and safety, tried to explain that the materials were innocent, that he had bought the radio legally, that the books must have come from Natalia's school friends, that there was no dissident activity in their home. The officers were not interested in explanations. They completed their search, filled out an extensive inventory of confiscated items, and informed Dmitri that he should expect to be called in for questioning. They told Elena that her employment at the library would be reviewed, and they told Natalia that she was to report to the district KGB office the following Monday for a formal interview that would determine whether criminal charges would be filed. After the officers left, just past 1 in the morning, the Kuznetsov family sat in their ransacked apartment and tried to understand how their lives had fallen apart in less than a week. Natalia finally told her parents everything: the essay, the interrogation at school, the questions about where she had gotten her ideas. Elena began to cry. Dmitri sat very still, his face pale, already calculating the consequences, already understanding that this was not something that could be explained away or apologized for. The system had taken notice of them, and once the system took notice, there was very little anyone could do to make it look away. The following Monday, October 18th, Natalia reported to the KGB district office as instructed. This interrogation was more formal, conducted by a senior officer who had her statement typed up by a secretary and required her to sign each page. She was questioned for 5 hours, with a break for lunch that she was too nauseated to eat. The questions were repetitive and exhausting. The officer wanted names. He wanted to know every person who had ever discussed Western culture with her, every friend who might have shared forbidden books, every adult who had encouraged her interests. Natalia tried to protect her friends by being vague, tried to shield the elderly woman at the library who had once mentioned having heard the BBC, tried to avoid implicating anyone else in what she was beginning to understand was a disaster of her own making. But she was 16, and she was terrified, and over the course of 5 hours, she gave them enough information to create a web of connections that the KGB found interesting. She mentioned a boy in her class whose father worked as a translator and might have access to foreign publications. She remembered a conversation with a neighbor's cousin who had visited from Estonia and talked about listening to Finnish radio. She admitted that her father's radio could pick up Western broadcasts and that she had occasionally listened to music programs. Each admission was typed into the official record. Each name was noted down. Each connection was mapped. The interrogator assured her that cooperating was in her best interest, that the authorities understood she was young and had been misled, that if she was completely honest, things would go easier for her and her family. At the end of the session, Natalia was not arrested, but she was informed that she was under investigation for anti-Soviet agitation and that her case would be reviewed to determine appropriate measures. She was told to report back in 1 week for a final decision. Meanwhile, Dmitri Kuznetsov had been called in by the director of the Kirov plant and told that his security clearance was being suspended pending the outcome of the investigation into his family. He was reassigned from his position in the engineering department to a temporary role in the loading docks, a manual labor position that was both humiliating and poorly paid. The director was apologetic but firm. Anyone under KGB investigation could not be permitted to work on projects with any security relevance, and until the matter was resolved, this was the best that could be offered. Dmitri understood what this meant. His career was over. Even if the investigation eventually cleared him, the stain would remain. He would never be trusted with significant responsibilities again. His colleagues would avoid him. His prospects for advancement had evaporated. At 43 years old, with decades of loyal work behind him, he had become an internal exile in his own workplace. Elena faced a similar reckoning. The library director called her in and explained with evident discomfort that given the ongoing investigation, Elena's employment was being terminated. There was no dramatic firing, no loud accusation. The director simply explained that the library had to maintain appropriate political standards, that employing someone whose family was under investigation was inappropriate, and that Elena's services would no longer be required. Elena was asked to leave immediately. By the end of October, the Kuznetsov family had been effectively destroyed economically. Dmitri's income had been cut by more than half. Elena had no income at all. Their savings were modest, enough to cover perhaps 2 months of expenses if they were extremely careful. And hanging over everything was the unresolved question of what would happen to Natalia, whether she would face criminal charges, whether the investigation would expand further, whether things could possibly get worse. They learned quickly that they could. In Soviet society, political disgrace was not merely a matter of losing one's job. It was a comprehensive social death that affected every aspect of life. Once word spread that the Kuznetsov family was under investigation, neighbors who had been friendly for years suddenly found reasons to avoid them. The people who had gathered in the communal kitchen to share tea and gossip now left quickly when Elena appeared. Mothers who had let their children play with Natalia suddenly discovered that their children were too busy with homework and couldn't come outside. The mechanism was partly fear and partly genuine disapproval. Some neighbors were afraid of being associated with a family under investigation, worried that showing sympathy might draw unwanted attention to themselves. Others were true believers in the system, genuinely offended by the idea that someone in their building had been spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, angry that the Kuznetsovs had betrayed the collective trust. Natalia found herself completely isolated at school. Although she had not been formally expelled, she was removed from her regular classes and assigned to what was essentially an internal exile within the school system. She attended classes in a small room with other problem students, children who had behavioral issues or learning difficulties, and she was taught by a rotating series of teachers who made clear their disapproval of her presence. Her former friends avoided her in the hallways. The unofficial word had gone out. Natalia Kuznetsova was politically unreliable, and association with her was dangerous. One of her closest friends, a girl named Olga, who had known Natalia since they were 7 years old, tried to maintain the friendship at first. She would walk home with Natalia after school, would sit with her during lunch, would whisper encouragement, and promise that everything would be okay. But after 2 weeks, Olga's parents forbade any further contact. Olga's father worked for the city government, and he could not afford to have his daughter associated with a family under KGB investigation. Olga cried when she told Natalia they couldn't be friends anymore, but she followed her parents' orders. She had no choice. In the Soviet system, family survival always came before individual friendship. The isolation extended to every corner of life. Dmitri found that his party membership was being reviewed, which meant he could be expelled from the party, which would in turn mean he could be fired entirely from the Kirov plant rather than just demoted. Elena discovered that her request to extend their residence permit for the apartment was being held up by bureaucratic complications, a strong hint that they might eventually be forced to leave Leningrad entirely. Natalia learned that her application to the Komsomol, the Young Communist League that nearly every Soviet teenager joined, and that was essential for future educational and career opportunities, had been rejected without explanation. They were being systematically erased from normal Soviet life, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They had committed no crime that would result in arrest or exile to a labor camp, but they were being squeezed out through 1,000 small cruelties, each one officially justified, each one individually defensible, each one contributing to a comprehensive campaign of social and economic destruction. Throughout all of this, Vera Sokolova continued teaching her classes, grading her papers, going through the motions of her job, but she could not escape the knowledge of what she had done. She had seen Natalia's empty seat in her literature class, had heard the whispers among students about what had happened to the Kuznetsov family, had understood that her decision to report the essay had set all of this in motion. She told herself that she had no choice, that she was required to report such material, that failing to do so would have destroyed her own life without helping Natalia. She reminded herself that she was not the one who had written the dangerous essay, that Natalia had made her own choices, that a 16-year-old girl should have known better than to put such thoughts on paper. She tried to convince herself that she was not responsible for the consequences, that she had simply followed proper procedures, that the real blame lay with whoever had exposed Natalia to Western propaganda in the first place. But the guilt gnawed at her. It disrupted her sleep and shadowed her days. She found herself thinking about Natalia constantly, wondering what was happening to the girl, worrying about whether the investigation would result in criminal charges, feeling the weight of her decision like a physical presence. In early November, Vera did something that was both brave and futile. She went to the district party office and requested a meeting with the committee secretary who was overseeing the educational aspects of the Kuznetsov case. She explained that Natalia had been an excellent student, that the essay had likely been an isolated instance of youthful indiscretion rather than genuine anti-Soviet sentiment, that perhaps with proper re-education, the girl could be brought back into the fold. The party secretary listened politely and thanked Vera for her input. He assured her that all factors were being considered, that the authorities understood the complexity of dealing with misguided youth, and that appropriate measures would be taken. He also reminded Vera that she had done the correct thing by reporting the essay, and he suggested that excessive sympathy for ideological deviance was itself a kind of political unreliability. Vera left that meeting understanding that her intervention had accomplished nothing and might actually have made her own position more precarious. She had shown perhaps too much concern for a student who had been designated as politically problematic, and in the Soviet system, such concern could be interpreted as suspicious. She never spoke publicly about Natalia's case again, but the guilt remained, a constant companion that would follow her for the rest of her life. On November 8, 1976, nearly a month after the essay had been submitted, the investigation into Natalia Kuznetsova was officially concluded. The decision was handed down by the district KGB office after consultation with the regional party committee and the educational authorities. Natalia would not face criminal charges. She was 16 years old, and the Soviet Union generally avoided prosecuting minors unless the offense was particularly severe or part of an organized dissident network. Moreover, the investigation had revealed no evidence of such a network, no adult conspirators, no ongoing anti-Soviet activity beyond the single essay and the possession of some forbidden books. However, Natalia's academic future was effectively destroyed. She was permanently expelled from secondary school number 47, and her records were marked with a notation indicating ideological unreliability. Any future application for higher education would be automatically flagged and would almost certainly be denied. Her dream of attending university, of studying literature, of becoming a writer or teacher, was finished before her 16th birthday. She was instead assigned to a technical school where she would learn a trade, specifically industrial sewing, a path that would lead to work in a textile factory making uniforms or cheap clothing. This was not a suggestion, but a directive. In the Soviet system, education and employment were planned by the state, and once someone was designated as politically problematic, their options narrowed dramatically. The notation in her file would follow her forever. Every time she applied for a job, every time she needed official documents, every time she interacted with Soviet bureaucracy, that notation would be there, visible to anyone with access to her records, marking her as someone who could not be trusted, someone who had deviated from proper Soviet thinking, someone who would never be given positions of responsibility or opportunities for advancement. For Dmitry and Elena, the consequences were equally permanent. Dmitry remained at the Kirov plant, but was never reinstated to his engineering position. He spent the next 14 years, until the Soviet Union collapsed, working in manual labor and low-level administrative roles, watching younger engineers who had once been his subordinates rise to positions he could never attain. His party membership was eventually restored, but it was an empty gesture, a formality that changed nothing about his actual status or prospects. Elena was never able to find equivalent work after being fired from the library. She eventually found a part-time position, doing inventory at a state warehouse, work that was mind-numbing and poorly compensated, but at least provided some income. The family's standard of living, which had been modest but comfortable, declined sharply. They could no longer afford small luxuries like restaurant meals or theater tickets. They shopped at the cheapest stores and wore their clothes until they fell apart. They learned to live with the constant anxiety of knowing that they were one bureaucratic decision away from complete destitution. The apartment, at least, they were allowed to keep, though the periodic reviews of their residence permit were a recurring source of stress. They remained in Leningrad, but they were ghosts in their own city, people who had been pushed to the margins of Soviet society and were constantly reminded of their diminished status. The full scope of what happened to the Kuznetsov family only became clear years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed and archives began to open, after people who had been involved in the case could speak without fear, after Natalia herself was able to tell her story. She eventually married, had children, survived the chaotic 1990s, and lived to see a Russia that was different from the Soviet Union of her youth, though not always in the ways she might have hoped. Vera Sokolova continued teaching until her retirement in 1988, 3 years before the Soviet Union fell apart. She lived quietly, alone, in her small apartment, and she never spoke publicly about the Kuznetsov case until 1997, when she was interviewed for an oral history project documenting the Soviet education system. In that interview, she finally admitted what she had done and why. She explained the impossible choice she had faced, the fear that had driven her decision, the guilt she had carried for 2 decades. She wept during the interview, and she said that if she could go back, she didn't know if she would make the same choice. But she understood that in the system in which she lived, there had been no good options, only varying degrees of self-preservation. The story of Natalia Kuznetsova's essay is not unique in Soviet history. Thousands of similar cases played out across the 7 decades of Soviet power, each one a small tragedy, each one a microcosm of how totalitarian systems function, how they turn ordinary people into instruments of oppression, how they create circumstances where the only choice is between betrayal and self-destruction. What makes Natalia's case particularly poignant is how ordinary it was. She was not a dissident, not a political activist, not someone trying to overthrow the system. She was a 16-year-old girl who loved literature and music, who had a curious mind and access to forbidden books, who made the mistake of being honest in a society that demanded conformity. Her teacher was not a monster, but a frightened woman trying to survive in a system that punished anyone who showed the slightest deviation from absolute loyalty. And the consequences were not dramatic or theatrical, but grinding and permanent, a slow-motion destruction of dreams and opportunities that played out over years of the Soviet Union.